Good evening, everybody. Parking's been a nightmare here tonight, so we were just giving everybody a second to get settled. But my name's Sebastian Lay. I'm the MBL's Chief Advancement Officer, so that means primarily that I get to nudge you all, as you know, or many of you know, to make sure that your cell phones are please turned off and silenced for the duration of this lecture. And the Q&A that will follow, and also to let you know that this evening's lecture and Q&A are both recorded and webcast. First, I'll start off by thanking the Friends of the MBL. The Friends of the MBL help to support and organize these Falmouth forums, the Science Before Supper series, and provide a connection to the community for the MBL, and importantly are a key part of this Falmouth Forum series, which provides sort of cultural enrichment, scientific enrichment, and intellectual connection for the community. Tonight's lecture is actually a special one in that it's the Herman T. Epstein Endowed Memorial Lectureship. And Herman Epstein was one of the founders, and I think really the person who conceptualized the Falmouth Forum as a series to bring a non-scientific, primarily, set of talks and convenings to Woods Hole outside of the summertime, sometimes in the summertime, actually, as well. And so Dr. Epstein was born in 1920 in Poland. In Portland, Maine. It's Friday. To Russian immigrants. And he is a physicist. And during the Second World War, he met his wife, Doris Wright, from Milwaukee, and they married. They were married for nearly 60 years, something I'm working towards slowly but surely, my wife. During the Second World War, he did hydrodynamics research with the precursor agency to NASA, and he returned to Michigan to complete his PhD in physics. He went on to be a professor of biophysics at Brandeis, and during the course of his career, aside obviously from doing research and teaching, he published dozens of papers and 2 books on the subjects of brains, minds, and education. And he was really dedicated to the problem of how to improve education and how to improve the performance of children in school. He designed courses on science for non-scientists, something that I, to this day, am greatly appreciative of, as I benefit from that every summer here and year-round by the incredible faculty that are available to us here at the MBL. His educational efforts crossed high school through college and beyond. And upon retirement, he continued that work at MBL. And this lectureship and this series is really founded in that spirit of conveying science, cultural issues, history, literature, and the questions of our time to the community, and really engendering conversations and discussions that can help us better understand each other and the world around us. So I think we can all hopefully keep Dr. Epstein in mind as we hear tonight's lecture. We have 2 ambassadors in the house tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce Day Mount, a member of the Friends of the MBL board, former ambassador to Iceland, who will introduce us to tonight's speaker. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, about the Falmouth Forum as a friend, you know, we all receive requests for donations at this time of year, and if you're like myself, you try to evaluate the importance of each request. And that's hard because we can't observe the activities of many of the charities that we give to or even begin to calculate the actual impact of our contributions. However, you all know the Falmouth Forum. We have been here for you year in and year out for 30 years for free. Now we need some financial help. Our Falmouth Forum endowment goal is $100,000 to be reached by June 30th, 2020. We have a $25,000 match for all new donations made by the end of this month, by 12/31/19. So please take the envelope that's with your program and please help us out. After all, where else can you learn about turning foxes into dogs in 1 week? And tonight, hear the Chief Executive Officer of President Carter's Center in Atlanta talk about their significant programs for women and girls. So let me introduce Ambassador Mary Ann Peters. As you've seen in your program, Ambassador Peters has a wonderfully impressive background, a background that uniquely prepares her for this talk tonight. Of course, she's been Chief Executive Officer at the Carter Center for 5 years. She has directed and participated in their programs. She's seen them firsthand. She also came to the Carter Center with academic experience both at the Marshall Center in Germany and the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Add to that 30 years of foreign service experience in both the developed and developing worlds. While I'm sure that her time at our embassies in Sofia, Moscow, and Dhaka brought some motivating lessons about the treatment of women, I am also sure that her assignments in the developed world, including our own country, also showed need for improvements. Her distinguished career shows that she has set an excellent example. Please welcome Ambassador Mary Ann Peters.
Thank you, Day. Can everyone hear me? I'm delighted to be here this evening at the Falmouth Forum to talk about empowering women and girls and why that matters. And tonight, I have essentially 2 stories to tell about women and girls in our world. The first story is the old story, but it's one that is still very much in evidence in many places around the world. And that is the story of the abuses suffered by women and girls and their exclusion from economic opportunities and political decision-making. I'm going to spend a little time painting this picture because I think it's important for us to realize how widespread abuses against women and girls are and how persistent their consequences. As the Carter Center founder, former President Jimmy Carter, often says, the most pervasive and worst violation of human rights in the world today is the abuse of women and girls. In fact, he wrote a book about this, published in 2014, which is called A Call to Action: Women, Religion, Violence, and Power, in which he described these abuses. The preamble to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. But though we women are clearly members of the human family, human rights abuses against women and girls are tragically common. I want to be very clear here. Men and boys suffer human rights abuses too, all too often. But the abuses of women and girls that I'm going to be talking about take place mainly just because these people were born female. Women and girls are not adequately protected by international human rights law or by the laws of the countries where they live, even though those laws on paper often mirror international conventions that enshrine equality for women. The sad fact is that wherever people are suffering from poverty, disease, persecution, or the ravages of war, women and girls almost always suffer the most. They must often stand aside when males are given priority for whatever is in limited supply, be that food or access to education. They're called on to care for the diseased or maimed, even if they themselves are also stricken. They're the ones who are raped by marauding troops, often as a deliberate act of terrorism, who are forced to endure genital mutilation as girls, or even put to death as infants because they lack the worth of a son. President Carter has pointed to the fact that 160 million girls are missing from Asia, mostly from China and India. And a journalist called Amara Fistendahl has written a book called Unnatural Selection, Choosing Boys Over Girls and the Consequences of a World Full of Men, in which she explains that the missing females were selected out of existence when parents decided, usually following an ultrasound, that they wanted a son and not a daughter. Now, there's not much research yet on the consequences of this imbalance, but in certain parts of India and China, where the natural ratio of girls to boys was particularly distorted, we may see an increase in the purchase of child brides, and even an increase in the trafficking of women. And we may also see a rise in instability. Where you have a large cadre of young, unmarried men, you also have an increased risk of violence. To continue this old story of abuses, in some countries, girls who have been kidnapped and raped are still murdered with impunity. I'm sorry, this won't stay. By their own brothers or fathers to avenge the family's honor. Child brides are still common. There are at least 250 million women in the world today who were married before the age of 15, and millions who were married even younger. These child brides are much more likely to be exposed to domestic and other forms of violence. They're more likely to die in childbirth, and the children they have as teenagers are less likely to thrive. And of course, they miss any chance of getting an education. I mentioned domestic violence because it tends to be worse against child brides. But I want to digress here and tell a story from my time living and working in Bangladesh, where about 2/3 of married women experience domestic violence. In Bangladesh, many women have improved their lives by getting jobs in the textile sector. These jobs are not perfect by any means, but the ability to earn an income reduces the incentives for early marriage and provides women with more decision-making power at home, greater voice in the social sphere, and improved self-esteem. But one less talked about result of getting a job, something I learned from talking with some of these women, is that husbands are less likely to beat wives who bring home an income. Far from Bangladesh, in Africa and the Middle East, one of the most dangerous abuses of women and girls, in this case girls, is female genital mutilation, or FGM. More than 133 million girls and women have experienced some form of FGM in the 29 countries where this harmful practice is still common. This practice is a violation of human rights, and it's often, even usually, against the laws of the countries where it is practiced. 18 countries in Africa have enacted laws criminalizing FGM, and the penalties range up to life in prison, yet the practice persists. The Carter Center's work in Liberia has taught us that the conventional approach to ending this harmful practice is simply not effective, and that usual approach is to condemn the practice and threaten the practitioners with legal action. But changing deeply rooted cultural practices requires true community ownership. Only then will it be sustainable. Now, violence against women, as I'm sure you realize, is most often perpetrated by men, but FGM is an exception. The mothers and grandmothers of the girls involved normally support the process because they fear no one will marry their daughter or granddaughter if it is not performed. And the procedure is actually done by women who make their living as so-called cutters. In Liberia, the practice takes place in sacred spaces called groves, run by the traditional women leaders of the village, who are called Zos. The Carter Center supports an initiative to involve these women, who are leaders in their communities in larger discussions of traditional practices and the rights of girls. And practically, we support the development of cooperative businesses such as soap making or charcoal making or weaving that provide alternatives to cutting as a source of income. In Ghana, the Carter Center works with religious and community leaders to turn them into champions for women and girls. Our goal is to enlist religious leaders to discourage practices that masquerade as religion, such as FGM or early forced marriage or honor killing. Many Muslim and Christian leaders who have participated in our workshops were astonished to learn that neither the Quran nor the Bible calls for FGM. Now I'd like to show you a video about a Carter Center program in Ghana that teaches community leaders about human rights. Cue the first video.
So you have the right to go to school. Yes. So which means that all of you here, your right is fulfilled, right? Yes. So can we give a high five to our parents? Yay!
Asma Ayub is a counselor at the Ghana Lebanon Islamic Secondary School in Accra, where about 70% of the students are girls.
She has been teaching us human rights and human rights for girls.
In August 2015, Ayub was chosen to take part in a Carter Center-sponsored human rights training program in Senegal, run by the center's partner, Tostan. The training inspired her to introduce a human rights curriculum at her school.
If I look back into the community where I grew up from, I saw physical abuse on girls sometimes because they were vulnerable. As I grew up, as I had exposure, as I had the experience, I had to speak out because I had to be a voice for the young girl.
I didn't know that you are not supposed to be forced to marry someone if you don't want to.
The Tostan model empowers communities to change from within. Ayub got community buy-in for her concept, and the classes focus on 3 areas of human rights.
They had the right to be free from all forms of violence, and then another one is the right to choose a partner, fighting against forced marriage. And then the third one is the right to education.
I was very excited when I heard about it.
Ruka'atu Masa teaches at the school and has a daughter enrolled there. She supports the new curriculum.
It's a very good idea for them knowing their rights at this age.
I think now I know my human rights. If someone wants to take them away from me, I know how to take them back. One of the things I also do is trying to improve upon their self-esteem, because I feel that no matter how much they have, how much information or exposure, if you're not confident enough, if you're not vocal enough to voice it out, nobody else would know what's in your head.
Madam Asma taught us to have the confidence to do anything, because it's not the matter about being afraid, it's the matter about using your rights that you have.
My dreams for the girls in the school, I would say it's actually bigger than what I would dream for myself.
I want to be a doctor.
I want to be a nutritionist. I want to be a pediatrician.
I don't want to be like Madam Asma and defend people's rights.
I see them as another generation coming up. They should have better opportunities, be able to achieve their full potential.
You know, sometime after this video was made, we learned that one of the girls in this school, who was 13 at the time, told Asma, the teacher you saw in the video, that her parents intended to pull her out of school and marry her to a much older man. And Asma, in turn, talked to the school headmaster, a respected Muslim leader, who persuaded the parents not to go ahead with the marriage. Forced early marriage and FGM are just 2 of the human rights violations that women suffer just because they're women. More than 70% of all human trafficking victims are women and girls, most of them destined for forced marriage or the sex trade. And 75% of AIDS cases in sub-Saharan Africa are women and girls. Happily, the percentage of primary school-aged girls in school where they belong has gone up to 86% worldwide, but it is still too low in many countries, and there are still tens of millions of girls worldwide who are not in school. Education is indeed a universal human right, and yet women are more likely than men to be illiterate. And many are illiterate because they were taken out of school precisely because they were girls. And yet we have known for many years, for decades, that the single most important predictor and enabler of economic development is educating girls. A woman I met in Liberia a couple of years ago, whose name is Ma Bindu, told me that in Liberia, rural women were traditionally treated as the property, the chattel of men, and only earlier this century gained more independent status. But she added, and she poked me in the ribs when she said this, most of the women in the village still don't know about their rights because they cannot read. And those men in the village who could read hadn't bothered to mention the changes in women's status. Worldwide, a large majority of the poorest people are women. And one reason is that laws, or more usually customs, limit women's ability to inherit or own land, especially in Africa and Asia. And of course, owning land is key to supporting a family. Here is a Carter Center video that illustrates the barriers women face in getting to own land. Second video, please.
Georgina Kamara, her sister, and their children lived on their father's land in Montserrado County, Liberia. When he died, her uncle insisted they move because, as women, they could not own land, or so he said. Women around the world suffer from discriminatory laws and patriarchal cultures that deprive them of equal rights and place them at constant risk. Underpinning these adversities is a lack of information necessary for change. When you inform women, you transform lives. Teaching women about their right to access information raises their voices, enables them to participate in decision-making, and helps them to become more economically empowered. Ultimately, it's about ensuring equality and creating President Carter's vision of a world free of discrimination and violence against women. After training from the Carter Center, Georgina requested information from the mayor's office and learned that she and her sisters were the rightful heirs to her father's land. The Carter Center will continue our pioneering and proven model of advancing women's right to information. Working with existing women community leaders and developing new ones, women will be reached with the tools to seek life-changing information and build more inclusive communities. We will build hope for the world's most vulnerable women so they too can be empowered to transform their lives.
So Georgina got title to her land, but many women are still cheated out of their inheritance. Women's right to life, to the sanctity of their persons, to economic opportunity, to education, to a political voice, are all violated routinely. But it's war that is the greatest violator of human rights, and especially women's rights. No one has rights in a war zone, but in particular, the rights of women and girls are trampled. In modern civil conflicts, rape is often used as a deliberate military or ethnic cleansing tactic by one side or by all sides. This was true in the Balkan War of the 90s, as well as in the conflicts in West Africa in the same decade. In Sierra Leone, it is believed that 275,000 women were raped during the civil war there in the 1990s, and that is out of a population of 4 million people, or about 2 million women. So this is the old story, powerful and still all too true, of women as victims of human rights abuses and of war. I've given you a number of examples of violence against women because they are women, of violations of their human rights because they are women. And these abuses represent a terrible injustice. But violence against women, it turns out, is bad not only for women, but for men as well. To put it another way, respect for women's rights is good for everyone. In her 2012 book, Sex and World Peace, Valerie Hudson demonstrated that, quote, the very best predictor of a state's peacefulness is not its level of wealth, its level of democracy, or its ethno-religious identity. The best predictor of a state's peacefulness is how well its women are treated. And Hudson also cited evidence that the status of women is the best predictor of a country's health, economic growth, lack of corruption, and other positive social indicators. According to UN statistics, closing the gender gap in education adds 0.5% to a country's GDP, and that benefits everyone, men and boys, as well as women and girls. And when women work, they invest 90% of their income back into their families, compared with 35% for men. So ending violence and discrimination against women is good for everyone, but it's not enough to end the victimization of women. When women become actors in the arenas of power, things really start to change. And this is the newer story I want to tell. Empowering women is good for just about every sector of human activity, including peace, governance, economics, and the environment. I'd like to focus first on the benefit of women as actors, as change agents in ending conflict and building lasting peace. Nearly 20 years ago, in 2000, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. The resolution recognizes that women's exclusion from peace processes not only contravenes their rights, but also reduces the chances for success. Resolution 1325 calls for participation of women in all levels of decision-making on conflict resolution and peace building. And as it happens, women's roles in peace building are especially critical to resolving 21st century conflicts because the character of war has changed. Few modern conflicts resemble the state versus state, country versus country wars of the 20th and previous centuries. Almost all conflicts now are civil wars, though often with outside actors seeking to intervene on one side or another. Syria is, of course, a prime example. In these wars, women are killed, wounded, raped, and uprooted in large numbers. Yet Resolution 1325 has only rarely been respected and implemented in peace-building processes. In recent negotiations for which information is available, women have represented fewer than 9% of participants and fewer than 4% of signatories, and no woman has ever been appointed chief or lead mediator in UN-sponsored peace talks. Yet we now know that peace agreements reached through a process that includes women are more likely to last than agreements reached among male combatants. A study of 40 modern conflicts showed that when women are able even to influence negotiations, not even necessarily to participate directly, the odds of reaching an agreement go up. And a UN study showed that if women actually do participate in negotiating the peace agreement, the probability that agreement will last 15 years or more goes up 35%. But despite the impact of modern conflicts on women, and despite the evidence that peace is more likely to be attainable and sustainable if women are included, they are rarely invited to the negotiating table. In today's conflicts, the usual invitees to the peace table are the men who lead the armed groups, who have fought the war and probably started it, the men with guns. Now, when you think about it, this is very different than what happened in the wars typical of the 20th and prior centuries. Those wars were started by monarchs or politicians and fought by relatively disciplined armies who stopped fighting when told to do so. And at that point, the generals gave the baton back to the political leaders and diplomats to negotiate the peace. But in today's conflicts, the violent men, not the men of peace, are at the negotiating table, and women are usually not there at all. It turns out, no surprise, that this is not a good recipe for peace. In fact, the absence of women from the peace table is an excellent predictor of recurring conflict. Now, why would that be the case? Well, like men, women play a variety of roles during conflict. There are women perpetrators as well as victims, leaders with powerful voices, as well as those whose voices cannot be heard. But on average, women experience modern conflict differently than men do. Men are more likely to be killed in the fighting, but women suffer more from the corollaries of war: rape and other human rights abuses, economic devastation, increases in crime and disease. Perhaps because of their different experiences in both war and peacetime, women tend to raise different priorities during peace negotiations, priorities that are more likely to include social and humanitarian needs that address the underlying causes of conflict. The armed men come to the table to talk about who gets what, while the women, when they are included, come prepared to talk about who will take responsibility for reopening schools and clinics or rebuilding roads. It's hard to get women around the peace table, but women are not waiting to be asked to make peace, as you will see in this clip about how women brought an end to the civil war in Liberia in 2003. This is a clip from a documentary called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. And I warn you, the first part of the clip is hard to watch. Cue the third video.
There was a news flash again on Liberia, and a missile had landed inside the American embassy compound, where many displaced Liberians were staying. I just thought of my own children, and I was just raging inside. So I told Sugars, today is showdown. Send for more women. So I told the women, sit at the door and loop arms, one arm within the other. And the next thing we heard on the overhead speaker was, oh my God, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the peace hall has been seized by General Lima and her troops.
They really came and locked us in that nobody will come out until that peace agreement was signed, even if it means staying there for days.
Is that it? Well, I think that is the end of the video. The narrator, the woman who was referred to as General Lima, is Lima Gaboe, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work organizing the women of Liberia to demand peace. And if you haven't seen the documentary about this heroic action, it's called, as I said, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, and it tells an amazing story. It was made by Abigail Disney, I think Walt Disney's daughter, along with 4 other documentaries in a series called Women, War, and Peace, and they're all worthwhile. Now, the clip we just watched shows the end of the Liberian story when the women barricaded the building in Accra, Ghana, where peace negotiations were being held, and refused to allow the men out without a peace agreement. But frankly, the beginning was even more inspiring as thousands of Christian and Muslim women dressed in white together risked their lives to gather every day along the route traveled by President and warlord Charles Taylor to demand that he make peace. Thousands of miles from Liberia, another woman named Fatima, Dr. Fatima Akilu of Nigeria, works for peace in another way to save young men from joining the vicious terrorist organization Boko Haram. Fatima is a participant in the Carter Center's Human Rights Defenders Network, and I'd like you to hear what she has to say about making peace as a woman. Cue the fourth video.
I think that if a fraction of the assistance is channeled to peace building efforts, I think we would save a whole generation.
Fatima Akilu is a Nigerian expert in countering violent extremism. She came to Washington, D.C. to talk with Senator Christopher Murphy, who serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
We spoke a little bit about what was going on in Nigeria in terms of the Boko Haram insurgency, the proliferation of light arms, light weapons in the hands of terrorists, and how that has caused a major humanitarian crisis, and also the nature of U.S. assistance to Nigeria. There's still an overemphasis on military approach to the solution, so we felt that aid should also be targeted at peace-building efforts.
Fatima explained to the senator how she's helping young people stay out of terrorist organizations.
First is the ideological disengagement, where we try to teach them that the ideology that is espoused by Boko Haram is really anti-Islam. We also try to offer them an opportunity for an education. A lot of them haven't had an education, an opportunity for livelihoods, and also psychosocial support, in particular counseling and trauma work.
She also spoke of just how many people her group has worked with.
Over the past 3 years, it's been hundreds and hundreds across, from de-radicalization in prisons to counter-radicalization, where we work in communities with schools to prevent people joining terrorist groups, and now with young women and girls who have been subjected to gender-based violence.
Fatima revealed the magnitude of the problem and just how many women and girls in Nigeria were vulnerable to gender-based violence, and how many could be reached by organizations like hers if they had the resources.
I think collectively, all the people working in this area could probably help about 80% of young people who are living in societies where we're bombarded by issues to do with lack of inclusion, marginalization. These are some of the push factors that have led people into terrorism.
There are women in Somalia, in Yemen, in Syria, and all around the world working in new ways to prevent conflict and make peace. And these are the heroines of the new story of women who are using their experiences and community stature to end conflict. So when it comes to peacemaking, involving women is not only the right and fair thing to do, it's the smart thing to do if we want sustainable peace. Women are not only underrepresented in peace negotiations, they are underrepresented in all kinds of political circles. Around the world, women are seriously underrepresented in both the legislative and executive branches of government. For instance, about 24% of members of national legislatures are women, and that's about the figure in the US, by the way. And that number is much lower in many countries. Does anyone know which country has the highest percentage of women in its national legislature? Iceland's a good guess, but this country happens to be in Africa. Yes, Rwanda. Yes, it is Rwanda, the small African country devastated by a genocidal conflict in 1994. And today, more than 60% of the seats in the lower house are held by women. And the story of how that came to be in the aftermath of the unimaginably brutal genocide is another illustration of the new story of women leading change. The road for women's increased participation in politics in Rwanda was paved by the 2003 Constitution, which set aside a quota of 30% for women in all decision-making organs, including 24 of the 80 seats in the lower house of Parliament. Now, there is some debate about imposing quotas. But in Rwanda, what happened was that women not only filled all the quota seats, but competed for the other 56 seats as political party candidates. Women with political experience and name recognition deliberately gave up their secure quota seats and competed against male candidates, which made it possible for women to exceed the quota ceiling of 30% and to obtain a majority in the lower house by 2008. But beyond the question of representation, of fairness, does it actually matter whether we have women in lawmaking bodies? Are outcomes any different? And it turns out to matter quite a lot. According to a report by the National Democratic Institute, quote, whether a legislator is male or female has a distinct impact on their policy priorities. Of course, women are not a homogeneous group, and there are many differences among them based on backgrounds and beliefs. But women's representation has important consequences, again, for everyone. As more women are elected, there is an increase in focus on priorities for families, children, and minorities. Women legislators are more likely to prioritize education, infrastructure, and health care. Women legislators are more likely to work across party lines, even in highly partisan environments. I wonder where you'd find one of those. They tend to be perceived as more honest and more responsive than their male counterparts, which encourages citizen confidence in democracy. And women legislators actually get more done. A recent study of our Congress found that the average woman legislator had 2.31 of her bills enacted, compared with the average male legislator who was able to enact only 1.57 bills. Leaving the math aside, though, or actually using it a different way, women legislators were 50% more effective by this measure of laws passed. So in politics as well as in peace building, including women is the key to better outcomes. And that's no less true in the economic sphere, where the gains from empowering women are also significant. As Valerie Hudson pointed out, greater gender equality is associated with better education and health, higher per capita income, faster and more inclusive economic growth, and greater international competitiveness. A widely quoted study by McKinsey says that closing various types of gender gaps in labor force participation would add between 12 and 25% to global GDP by the year 2025. And as I said earlier, when women work, they invest 90% of their income back into their families, compared with 35% for men. Now, earlier you saw a clip about Georgina claiming her father's land. That's an example of an innovative program started by the Carter Center to help women access resources and generate economic and educational progress for themselves, their families, and their communities. There are a number of nonprofits that work to empower women and girls, just as there are a number that work to increase transparency and access to information. But it was one of my colleagues at the Carter Center, Laura Newman, who narrated the video about Georgina, who figured out that in countries where male citizens have trouble accessing information to which they are entitled, women have significantly more trouble. The Carter Center has in fact proved the existence of this gender information gap in rigorous studies in Liberia, Guatemala, and Bangladesh. Just one illustration, in Guatemala, 81% of women need their husband's permission to leave the house, or else, and the or else includes violence. Another aspect of the studies was to station observers in government offices and watch how women who came seeking information of various sorts were treated. And as you can imagine, they were often told to go home, asked where their husband was, and otherwise dismissed. So now I'd like to show a final short video, an animated film that demonstrates how access to information can unlock the potential of women, perhaps particularly their economic potential. Last clip, please.
Access to information is a universal right, but across the globe, women often have trouble exercising this right. Without proper documents, they are cut off from important services. Without meaningful information, they can't make their voices heard. Many women have no time to seek out information because they face the double burden of earning an income and caring for their families. Others don't get the information they need because they are not aware of their rights or live in cultures that discourage women from pursuing them. As a result, in some parts of the world, only half the population can fully access information and the benefits it provides. But what if that changed? Information has the power to transform the lives of women around the world, helping them to understand the full range of their rights and to participate in public life, empowering them to achieve economic success and to make better decisions for their families and futures, enabling them to hold government officials accountable and to bring about change in the areas that matter most to them. The Carter Center's Global Access to Information program is working in countries around the world to help make sure women get the information they need. Inform women, transform lives.
So giving women opportunities to participate in peace building, in politics, and in the workforce benefits everyone. And this applies as well to the most pressing problem of our time, the climate crisis. Here again, we have the old story of women as victims alongside the new story of women as agents of change. Women are especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change due to poverty and their dependence on natural resources. 80% of people displaced by climate change are women, according to the United Nations. And the increase in climate-related natural disasters takes an acute toll on women. When they lose their homes, they are more likely to be sexually assaulted. Because of the economic consequences of the disaster, families are more likely to marry off their female children. And because it becomes harder to get health care, even maternal mortality rates increase. President Carter recently wrote an op-ed published by Time Online entitled, "How Empowering Women and Girls Can Help Solve the Climate Crisis." As he says, in most countries, women bear the largest burden in the gathering and preparation of food and water. And that means that women are best placed to devise responses to climate change that are effective and advance the status of women. Now, the overall mission of the Carter Center is to wage peace, fight disease, and build hope. And part of waging peace is seeking to end the age-old human rights abuses of women and girls. That will always be a core part of President Carter's legacy, and we will continue to devote ourselves to that work. But it is not enough. We need to end the many abuses of women and girls that still take place. But we also need to go one step further and empower women to change the world in ways that will benefit all of us. We need more women in positions of political power, power in passing legislation in their countries, and in ending conflict and building sustainable peace. We need women who own the land they farm, and women in the workforce to help create prosperity. And we need women who understand what is happening to their land, their water, their resources to help save our planet. To empower women in all these ways, they need access to information so they will know they are no longer chattel, that the land they farm belongs to them, and that their daughters have a right to go to school. So in conclusion, I hope you'll take away this evening the idea that including women in the labor market, in politics, and in decisions about war and peace is one of those issues where the right thing to do, the fair and just thing to do, is also the smart thing to do if we want to build a more peaceful, secure, prosperous, and just world. Thank you. That's great. Thank you so much. I'd love to sit. Thank you. Yes, it's perfect. It's perfect. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions. Oh, good.
So we have 2 microphones. So if you have a question, just please wait till a microphone arrives. There we
Thank you very much for this, very enlightening and meaningful presentation, particularly when we have women running for president of the United States now. But before going into that, could you just let us know how President Carter is? We're all thinking of him.
Thank you. I'd be delighted. He was released from his latest hospitalization just before Thanksgiving, and he's doing very well. As I understand it, he had the same treatment for a subdural hematoma that any of us would have had, and his doctors were quite pleased with his response. There were no complications, but there is a healing process. So he's fine. We all wish he would be more willing to use a cane after he broke his hip in June, but so he's still President Carter.
President Carter was also involved with monitoring elections around the world, and I was wondering whether there was any advice coming out of the Carter Center in the current situation in the United States.
I promise I didn't ask this nice lady to pose that question, but I should have. As a matter of fact, the Carter Center has in fact observed, I think now 107 elections over time in our history in dozens of countries. But it's our newest project that I think is the most relevant to your question. We've started a project called Digital Threats to Democracy. Now, we are not trying to compete with the real experts on cyber security and cyber hacking. What we are looking at is the use of social media to spread disinformation. And our area of expertise is in the developing world. However, we are working with people who are doing the same kind of work in other countries. And as an American, I couldn't be more concerned about the danger to democracy from manipulation of the cyber world, the internet, whether it's manipulation of social media or whether it's hacking directly into voting results to change them electronically. But I also want to alert you to the fact that all around the world there are democracies that are fragile, where people are really fighting to continue to live in a democracy. And no matter how poor a country is, it generates enough revenue to be attractive to bad actors. It's absolutely plausible that there are people sitting in tea houses right now plotting how to throw an election. Now, usually the scenario would be that the bad actors would approach an incumbent government and offer to manipulate social media to that government's advantage in return for perhaps infrastructure contracts worth $500 million over the next couple of years. That kind of manipulation could be almost invisible, and that's what we're starting to work on. So I think all over the world, this precious gift of democracy is under threat because, frankly, voters don't know whether they can trust the results. So thank you.
Everything you said today was very informative. One of the last messages you sent to us is empowering women through information. And the World Health Organization and other organizations have talked about reproductive health for women and reproductive rights because of high mortality death, because of teenage pregnancy. And I'm just wondering how the Carter Center deals with a very loaded subject or topic, and getting reproductive health information out to women.
Well, the Carter Center is philosophically very much in favor of and supportive of the right of women to have information about their reproductive rights and about family planning. But as it happens, our health programs are not focused in that area. We have a very specific health mission, which is to end a plague of certain really neglected and awful diseases that are called neglected tropical diseases, that are diseases that no one here will ever get or ever hear of. So that's what we do when we're on the ground in developing countries. We don't ourselves provide that information, but there are many organizations that do, and on the ground we have been in the same spaces, and as I said, we're very supportive of that right. It just doesn't happen to be in our wheelhouse at the moment.
Returning to empowering women, I know most of what you spoke about was in other countries and other parts of the world. And I know that this country has its issues as well. And I'm just wondering if the Carter Center looks at what the key issue or issues are for women in this country.
Well, Karen, President Carter included women in this country in his book. I don't know if this particular fact was in the book, but as it happens, excuse me, 30% of women around the world will experience violence in their lifetimes, and that statistic applies to the United States and Europe and other developed countries. As I said, in Bangladesh, the number is twice that. So President Carter's call for ending human rights abuses includes those that still go on in our country. And I'd say right now we have a particular focus on, in this country, on women's participation, or rather violence and threats against women in the political space. There are more women candidates, for instance, are subjected to higher levels of internet threats and violence. And that's another area in which we are taking a special look at women in this country.
I wondered whether in the developing countries, women who are seeking an education or trying to work or hold on to their land, whether they are punished by the men in their communities for what they're trying to do.
Oh yeah, if the men can get away with it, oh yes. It's quite dangerous, actually, to try to claim your rights as a woman. Because often there's this gap that I think was implied in some of the videos between the laws that are passed in the Capitol under the scrutiny of the international community and what really happens. And of course, the farther you get from the capital city, the less likely those new laws are to be respected. So to the point where when we go in, we listen to the people we're trying to assist. You know, we want to help them. We don't want to go in and say we're going to build you a road or a school or whatever. We want to find out what they want. And one of the first things we often hear when we listen is, please involve men. Sometimes it's because they want the whole community involved, but there's always an element of fear that if the men aren't involved and don't see some benefit to them, that it will be hard for the women to realize the benefits of the assistance. So absolutely.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Do you have any evidence at the Carter Center on the effectiveness of USAID, women's and gender programming for the kind of problems that you've discussed?
No, we haven't really made a separate study of the effectiveness of official assistance. By and large, of course, there's a lot of evidence that official assistance has not succeeded as well as we would have hoped. And that's regardless of what the target is, whether it's health or education or agricultural or whatever the target has been. In fact, there's a famous Zambian economist, Dambisa Moyo, who argues that aid not only hasn't helped Africa, but has damaged it. Now, she, of course, ignited a huge debate among development economists. I will say that I do think that aid givers don't listen enough. Often, aid givers, not just the United States, but governments and other large aid donors, go into a place and pretty much decide what is needed. And I think that is the biggest problem. And that would apply to projects for women and girls, because, if you don't listen to the women and girls who say, please involve the men, then, 5 years later, there's not going to be anything left. There was a book called A Time to Listen, written in 2012, I think, that demonstrates just how many aid projects failed to respond to the needs of the local community, which is, I think, where the roots of most of that failure lies. Thank you. Thanks very much. Oh, thank you, Sebastian. Oh, that was wonderful.